Hi everyone, thank you for joining us this evening. I'm just going to give it a few minutes before we make a start, just to give everyone a chance to join. Hi everyone, thank you so much for joining us today. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to the event this evening. I'm very conscious that I don't want to speak for too long at the start of this event because we've got a very exciting and a very, very packed schedule to get through this evening. My name is Emma and I'm the events officer at Hope for the Future. And I'm also joined this evening on the call by my colleagues Laura, who will be facilitating today's Q&A session, and Tom and Helena, who are working behind the scenes. If you haven't heard of us already, Hope for the Future is a climate communications charity which works nationally to equip communities and individuals to communicate the urgency of climate change with their local politicians. We feel that it's vitally important that MPs and constituents have rich and challenging conversations about the climate. As part of our work, we also support individuals and groups to organise local events with their MPs, which is what brings us here this evening. So welcome to the event. Before we begin, I'd just like to give you a little bit of a backstory as to how this event came to be. So back in February 2020, Hope for the Future supported members of Hope Valley Climate Action to meet with their recently elected MP, Robert Largan. Then to follow this up, we suggested running an event on one of the themes that had emerged as a result of this meeting. And subsequently, I was put in touch with members of the High Peak Green Network. And the network is relatively new. It encompasses several brilliant organisations that are operating within the High Peak, doing really great work on climate and environmental issues. And so working with Laurie, who's the coordinator of the network, and Zizi and Anne, we polled local issues on which we could hold an event amongst network members, and transport came out on top. And as a result, this is the event that we have for you. I just wanted to start by briefly talking you through the shape of this evening. We focused our theme by splitting it up into kind of three main parts. So firstly, we'll kick off in part one by looking at the current state of travel and transport in High Peak. To set the scene for tonight, we're beginning with an introduction from two of those local constituents who've been part of the event planning team, Laurie and Zizi. And then we'll go on to an overview of the travel and transport survey that was carried out by Hope Valley Climate Action last summer, and Steve Platt, another local constituent, will be delivering that for us. For the final part of this final section of part one, we'll then be going straight into a Q&A with some key local stakeholders to kind of explore, have a deeper dive and explore where we are right now with regards to transport in the area, and to unpick some of those issues that are being faced. Into part two, we'll be looking forwards at the potential solutions available to kind of get us where we want to go. So in other words, how can we ensure that High Peak and other rural places have adequate and sustainable transport provision in the future? And how can we ensure that people are going to use it? So in this part of the event, we'll be having short presentations from the Campaign for Better Transport, Hayfield Sustainable Transport, and Sustrans, before we go into another Q&A. And this is the point where we'll be taking questions from the audience. So while the speakers are kind of doing their thing and giving their presentations, please get involved and submit your questions at the Q&A box, which is at the bottom of your screen. And we'll be putting them to our speakers after they've presented. So please do get involved. Then finally, in part three, we'll be looking at how we can basically, what the next steps are that we should be taking. And to kick off this final section, we'll have a presentation from Age UK, who will be giving us an overview of their Sustainable Transport Service project, which launched in Cornwall in late 2018. So I'm really, really looking forward to that. And then finally, we'll close by inviting some local High Peak constituents who've kindly nominated themselves or been nominated to ask questions to Robert Largan about the issue of the night. So as you can see, it's quite a packed schedule. We've got a lot to get through, so let's crack on. Just before I stop talking though, and hand over to our speakers, I've just got to do a little bit of housekeeping. This webinar is being recorded and it will be available to watch on demand and for you to share. We'll be sending all of our attendees a follow-up email tomorrow with the link included and directing you to some of our Hope for the Future resources. We'll do our absolute best to stick to time tonight. We're scheduled to finish at 7 p.m. and that's very much when we're hoping to finish. And the last thing I want to say is I'd just like to ask that everyone is respectful of all the contributions that are given in tonight's webinar, both from our speakers who've kindly given up their time and also to your other attendees in the chat. So as I just mentioned, we'd love for you to get involved in today's event and you can do this by posting your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We'll be putting those to our speakers in part 2. You can also upvote questions. So if you see a question that you wish you thought of yourself or you particularly like to see answered, then just hit the little thumbs up icon next to the question and it will shoot to the top of the list. So for any questions that we don't get through this evening, because there's quite a lot of you on the event tonight, we'll collate these and look at trying to get some written response to you through your Eventbrite link. So also on your dashboard at the bottom of the screen, you'll see a chat box. Please use this as a space to kind of introduce yourself, say hi, tell us where you're from, and to kind of talk to your fellow attendees during the session about the content of the event. You can also get involved on social media using the hashtag HFTF-webinar, and you can also see our various kind of social media handles on the screen. Finally, at the end of the webinar, a feedback form will pop up in your browser. If you could take the time to fill this in, we'd really, really appreciate it because it just helps us evaluate how we run kind of these local constituency events. So that is everything from me. We'll go straight into kind of part 1 of part 1. So without further ado, I'll kind of hand over to Laurie and Zizi, if you want to turn your cameras on, to set the scene and welcome you to tonight's event.
Hi everyone. We all know climate change is happening and it's worsened every moment that we delay in making reductions to our fossil fuel consumption. There's lots of actions that need to be taken, and this evening we're here to specifically focus on transport. Our reasons for that are twofold. Firstly, to reach zero carbon in transport requires massive changes. As you can see, the yellowy line that's, turquoise line that's transport is now the top emitter, and other lines such as the brown and reddish ones, which are power and industry, have come down dramatically. All the other ones, buildings and waste and agriculture, have fallen a bit, but transport is largely the same as it was in 1990. Secondly, the other reason we're choosing transport this evening, it's a huge issue for those living in High Peak and for others living in rural areas across the country. All the 6 groups that have been involved in campaigning for greater action on climate change that are in the High Peak Green Network, of which both me and Laurie are involved in, all 6 chose transport as the top issue to focus this event on. That's how important it is to all of us. So we're pleased to be joined this evening by our local MP, Robert Largan, who's also on the Parliamentary Transport Select Committee, and we welcome his contributions to this event and also look forward to working together with him to tackle this key issue, both nationally and locally.
So where are we right now in the High Peak? Well, we think we're not in a good place. If we take public transport, we have a woeful lack of quality provision. On the trains are often cancelled at short or no notice. This isn't great when you're sitting on the station platform waiting for a train to take you for a scan at Stepping Hill Hospital. The train is then cancelled. You have to yell for car backup.
And for all the places not served by trains, which is, quite a lot in a rural area, buses are the most important form of public transport. But the problem is they don't go where you want them to. They go in and out of the cities, but not across the county. And then even if you do find a bus route that takes you where you need to go, just using them is a challenge. For example, I had to wait twice as long for an appointment at the Bakewell Hospital because the last bus back from Bakewell was 2:30 in the afternoon. That was the last bus back. So I had to wait an extra 3 weeks for an appointment at the morning clinic.
We all know that encouraging active travel is a brilliant way to reduce our carbon footprint. However, those of us who want to cycle to work or cycle to the shops or cycle to schools are continually frustrated by partial bits of cycle route. We often find ourselves suddenly and unexpectedly on roads with very heavy traffic. If you're going further afield, you can't always count on secure bike parking at the stations, and you can't guarantee that there's going to be space on the train to travel with your bicycle.
And additionally, if people just want to walk, it can be difficult because space and priority is given over to cars in rural areas.
Of course, these problems are not unique to the High Peak. I assume they're mirrored all across rural areas in England. We know that people want to do the right thing. They want to use buses and trains, they want to walk, they want to cycle, but all too often the barriers are too great. High Peak is a spectacularly beautiful region. We're surrounded by large urban areas, and as such, we get up to 5 million visitors every year, and we're having many more than that with the pandemic. Of course, visitors are welcome, but they come in cars. So our villages and towns, especially our honeypot villages like Hayfield locally, become distraught. Cars are parked inconsiderately, they block drives, they block buses even trying to get through the villages, and of course they block emergency vehicle access. What we've got now is a vicious circle. Less people on public transport leads to less provision, which leads to more cars. Less people are helped to walk or cycle, more cars. And what we really need to do is to switch this to a virtuous circle by making it much easier to walk and cycle and to get people on trains and buses and out of their cars.
So how do we get there? We're so pleased to be joined this evening by speakers from across the country and closer to home to share their wisdom with us of how we can move from the vicious circle we've described to a virtuous and sustainable one. We'll begin by hearing more about the many issues we're facing. It's important to take stock of where we are right now as we look forward. We'll then hear from other speakers about how we can get to where we want to go and the next steps required to get there. So thank you all for coming today. It will be exciting to hear from you all.
Thank you, Laura and Zuzu, for that brilliant introduction. We're now going to hear the kind of 5-minute overview of the Travel and Transport Survey from Steve Platt. So Steve, if you're ready, I'll hand over to you now.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Hopefully you can see my screen. I'm going to briefly report on this survey. The aim was to find out how people living in Hope Valley and visiting our area travel pre-COVID and whether they might change their pattern of behaviour. 467 people responded, 72 of whom are residents of Hope Valley and 28% are visitors. So where are people going to? First, note the very high dependence on private car use that was mentioned earlier by the previous two speakers. And secondly, note the contrast between Manchester and Sheffield. Train use to Manchester, 81% of people travel by train. Only 22% travel by train to Sheffield. Most residents are highly reliant on private cars as their main form of transport for regular journeys other than within their own village. Pre-COVID, only 6% of only 6% of residents relied solely on public transport, and only 1% walked or cycled for regular journeys. Young persons travel. School children are bigger users of public transport and walk and cycle more than adults. Nevertheless, the majority are still highly reliant on private cars for regular journeys, including the school run. About half of all residents said they were willing to change to a more sustainable form of transport for longer journeys. About over half of them said they were prepared to cycle or walk more. Again, over half were prepared to use the train and the bus more. More people were prepared to walk from home and drive their cars less. How much of this aspiration or intention translates into action, of course, is an open question. 63% of residents are intending to switch to an electric car. 60% of them within 4 years. What stops people walking, cycling, and using public transport? There are some things that we can't do much about, like topography and the weather, but there are others on which we can take action. The two key things that would help people walk and cycle more for regular journeys are safety and the two things that stop people are safety and distance. And the two key things that stop people using public transport are the frequency of services and the limited routes that are available to them. The key lesson from this is safer roads. The key thing that would encourage people to cycle more are safer roads. These are the things that would encourage people to use public transport more. 89% want more frequent services. 84% want a richer network. 82% want greater integration. The key problem is the chicken and egg issue. Current demand is insufficient to justify a better service, but unless we got a better service, people won't use it. In summary, there's an appetite for more sustainable travel, and many people are willing to consider switching if the conditions are right. These conditions include safer roads and ready access to high quality public transport. There's also an appetite for more working from home. What are we going to do about it? Well, Hope Valley is launching a travel project called Travel Right that will include encouraging active travel and promoting integrated transport. Finally, we've done some research into precedents in Europe, and this research suggests that greater regional coordination and customer-focused provision are crucial to getting superior rural transport. And I'll come back to this later in my question to Robert. Thank you.
Many thanks for that, Steve. That's really helped set the scene, I'm sure, for our audience today, but also not just for our audience, for the speakers that are in our first Q&A session. So we're going to head straight into that Q&A session now, but I'm just going to briefly introduce our three panelists before I hand over to my colleague Laura to chair. So we're joined today by Katherine Croney, Brian Taylor and Robert Largan, MP for High Peak. Katherine Croney brings her community engagement experience to her current role at the Hope Valley and High Peak Community Rail Partnership, working closely with stakeholders, partners and station group volunteers to develop projects at stations to benefit the local communities. Katherine's former experience as interpretation manager for the Peak District National Park Authority included developing key messages around sustainable transport. Within this role, her work ranged from promoting peak connections buses to interpretation of multi-user trails within the national park, especially to encourage cycling. Brian Taylor has worked for the Peak District Park Authority for 21 years, beginning in community planning and then moving into policy work. He's led the planning policy function as team manager since 2003. And in 2016, Brian became head of policy and communities, leading on local plan, community planning and sustainable transport in December. And then in December 2020, took on the role of head of planning for the national park, adding responsibilities for development management, enforcement and minerals. And then finally, Robert Largan MP. Robert was elected MP for High Peak in 2019. As Laurie and Zizi mentioned, Robert is a member of the Transport Select Committee and is keen to fight for more transport infrastructure investment in the north. In Robert's spare time, he really enjoys spending time in the Peak District National Park, particularly walking. So I'm going to invite our three speakers and Laura to turn their videos on now, and I will turn mine off.
Thanks, Emma. And thank you to everyone who has submitted questions in advance of tonight. We've had lots of submissions, so in the next 15 minutes or so, we'll try and get through as many as we can. So first up tonight, as Laurie mentioned earlier, through lockdown, there has been an influx of vehicles to the national park with people seeking access to green space in this strange time we're living in. So what do you think is the root cause of visitors coming to the Peak District in their cars? Is it that they're choosing to do so, or that there just aren't reliable or realistic travel alternatives that they can use? So Brian, should we come to you first as the Peak District representative?
Yeah, good evening. Hi. So I think it is more the first, really. I mean, people are coming from the deep urban areas, and really there's a lack of alternatives. Through the year, people haven't managed to get to the shopping centres or the cinema or to see their friends. So I mean, to be able to go on a day out, to the countryside, kind of harks back to traditional days of going out as a family, and even where people have gone to places where there are hotspots, I think in their minds it's still a day out. It's something they could do. The messaging has been really difficult in that respect, because we obviously try to follow government guidance, but the definitions aren't always there about what we mean by local, and people have different behaviour that comes with that. And we've been trying to promote the codes of countryside codes, and we've got an initiative called Peak District Proud, which is our local version of that, if you like, which is very much about behaviour and responsible visiting. And there's social media and messaging around that, and we want to continue that thinking. But yeah, so I think it tends to be a small proportion of the population that chooses public transport in that respect, even where it's there. People put themselves in the family car and come straight out. And actually a lot of the time people don't know what they want to do before they come out. They've just got an idea in their minds, head to a location, and it's probably the iconic one in their minds, whether it's Lady Bower or Castleton or Edale, and they go there in their hordes. And it's and actually, the observations we've had, someone said they think this is an England-wide issue. That is very true. The networks we're involved with tell us that. But actually, even in the Peak District, it's very hard now to find quiet areas. If you think, well, let's close an area off and manage people and move to other areas, everywhere feels busy now. And the messaging we're getting from every community in the national park is that they're experiencing similar things. So proves to be a difficult issue for management, that, because where do you redirect people to? Mm-hmm. So I think I'm sure we'll get more into these questions, but it is very much about great alternatives as we move forward. But I think for the next few years, we're in a culture of car ownership, and especially this year, 2021, once lockdown eases again, I think we can expect possibly even greater numbers than last time. That there's a fear out there, and that creates a lot of anxiety for people. So, you know, we've got a tough challenge ahead as a national park to, you know, get people out there enjoying the countryside for its original purposes, to get contact with nature and to ease some of the stresses they're facing from this situation we're in, but doing that in as responsible way as possible. So, you know, there's lots of partnership emerged out of this year, and that's positive.
Great, thank you. Robert, this one's specifically for you, submitted by Chinley and Bucksworth Travel and Transport Group. And they say that in the context of High Peak, you have very publicly supported better access to the railway. And do you agree that the prioritisation of step-free access to the railway should be a major priority for the Department for Transport? And how can this goal of step-free access to all stations nationwide be achieved?
Yeah, well, I completely agree, unsurprisingly. Yeah, I know the Chinley and Bucksworth group have been working for a long time to try and get step-free access at Chinley Station, which several of our stations in High Peak don't have step-free access either on one or both platforms. Chinley's where the problem's most acute because it's an island platform, so you can't get onto any of the trains step-free, and particularly with quite growing population in Chinley. It's a real problem, and definitely more progress is needed. The government has something called the Access for All Fund, which stations can bid to try and get step-free investment in. Unfortunately, the last round of that, Chinley and other stations in High Peak were unsuccessful. And part of the problem for that is because the way that the applications are determined is based on footfall. And as Steve said in his presentation, it's a bit of a chicken and egg thing, where the footfall at the station is low because there are a huge chunk of people who are unable to access the station. And therefore the calculations are, oh, well, footfall's low, so the number of people who benefit from step-free access is small. And so it's a bit of a backward way of looking at things. So I hope that there's going to be another round of applications for that funding, and I'll certainly be pushing hard for that. But we also need to remember that it isn't just about access for step-free access for those who have mobility issues. There are also entire parts of the High Peak, entire communities that don't have access to a station at all because there isn't one. A really good example being Gamesley, where there was supposed to be a station. There was sidings set up there when the new build housing estate was built in the late 1960s, and then they just never got around to building the thing. So that's another thing which really needs to be sorted to get more cars off the road, and for an area like Gamesley, open up access to more employment opportunities as well.
Thank you. And Katherine, on that one, have any initiatives been implemented by yourselves to encourage train travel in High Peak, for example?
Okay, hello everybody. I'll just echo what Robert was saying about Chinley, just to say that Derbyshire County Council have commissioned a feasibility study using Section 106 money from Chinley Parish to look at you know, a range of potential solutions for the platform and access. So that's going to be undertaken by Network Rail, hopefully very soon. So that was just that one. And sorry, your question was it about step-free access or about, sorry, the...
Yeah, so this question that's been submitted asks, what initiatives have the Hope Valley and High Peak Community Rail Partnership implemented to encourage train travel in the High Peak?
Okay, right, yeah. So bear with me because I haven't been in post very long. So, but what we have done, we try and work obviously with other local authorities like High Peak Borough Council itself. We've just developed a project looking at welcome and interpretation panels at each of the stations. So for New Mills, Central, New Mills, Newtown, Whaley Bridge, and Chapel, and we are looking at one at Chinley as well. So we're trying to work with people to try and encourage, you know, back onto the trains. We're also trying to look at improving station facilities And we have done a lot of work in the past looking at train timetables. So, for example, trying to get to the Buxton service for every 30 minutes, which was achieved, as well as the Hope Valley line becoming hourly services as well. We do actually try and publicise all our trains. We've just developed a new Facebook page, which we're trying to, support all our groups and our volunteers, and also give out, messaging about the about train travel, etc. Obviously, it's been quite challenging through the past year with the pandemic. We've obviously not been able to hold things like the folk trains, which we did, and the guided walks events. So they're things that we had done in the past. We'd love to see those back in the future, but obviously we are governed by the train operating companies. We cannot, promote, as they're saying, essential travel only. So it's a really tricky situation, I think, for all of us. But we have actually done some consultation with Northern, and we've got a new early morning stopping service at Doveholes for some of the students who need to get to Buxton. So again, we try and work with our train operators to encourage train travel. We really think collaboration is key, and obviously good publicity. And events are really important, but at the moment, obviously, we're having to put a hold on those. However, we are trying to explore more integration with the buses, and we'll be working with the National Park Authority on the Hope Valley Explorer bus, which will take people, say, from Bamford and links up with the Upper Derwent, for example, or you can get on the bus and it takes you to Castleton. So areas where the train obviously doesn't go. We're looking a lot at some disadvantaged groups as well. We're trying to develop work for young people and trying to get them out onto on the train in the future. And we're working with South Yorkshire PTE and with a group, a charity called Endeavour. And we would like to replicate that coming out from Manchester and the Stockport area as well into the High Peak. So we are doing a range of initiatives. We're trying really hard, but obviously with the pandemic, it's proving really, really hard for us to promote anything, especially when the train operators are saying essential travel only. And obviously with social distancing, it reduces the capacity on the trains as well.
Great, thanks, Catherine. Just going to move on, Brian, if that's okay, to talk about cycling, if that's all right. We've had loads of questions on cycling. So as Laurie and Zizi mentioned earlier, cycling can be a really hazardous adventure in the High Peak, especially if you're travelling on some of the existing cycleways. So are there any plans to create a network of safe cycle routes connecting villages in High Peak? I don't know if anyone wants to jump in on that one.
Yeah.
Ryan? Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, people would be familiar with the Monsell Trail. No, it's not quite the same area, but there is this commitment to the White Peak Loop, and that is a connection, right from gateway towns in Matlock through Bakewell and on to Buxton, to kind of get that complete route through there, which allows people to use that trail as local people as well as visitors. It's a piece of infrastructure that's available to everyone in that respect. But the other thing I'm aware of is that because obviously you can concentrate too much presence down one route sometimes. So I think a range of alternative routes is good thinking. And I know the Buxton Town team have been thinking about this as well with the County Council. And this idea almost of kind of what you might class as braided routes, a set of alternatives that link up existing rights of way and give people opportunities to walk and cycle out from the town into the country. So that's one thing. And I know that the Hope Valley Group are very keen to think about completion of the infrastructure network that's there, so right through the Hope Valley, and I think that's something we very much support.
Mm-hmm. Robert, did you want to come in there?
Yeah, just sort of a couple of things to add to that. First of all, there has been some government funding for sort of money to be put into cycling, which has been issued to Derbyshire County Council. Now, we're up to the second tranche of that funding. The first tranche was mostly for sort of temporary stuff related to COVID and improving cycleways and widening pavements and things like that. The second tranche was for a substantial sum of money, and there were 3 finalist schemes for that sum of money. One of them was a Buxton scheme. They've gone with Chesterfield for this second tranche, but another tranche is expected to be allocated to county councils soon. There's about 1.7 billion quid's worth of unallocated funding to try and improve sort of cycleways. So hopefully, when that next funding is allocated, we can get the Buxton scheme from being runner-up to being the winner. I'm talking to lots of other groups. In New Mills, there's a really sort of enthusiastic group there about trying to improve cycling there, perhaps linking the Set Valley Trail to the town centre. And beyond that, it's something that I've talked about quite a bit on the Transport Select Committee. We had Andy Burnham come on and to do an evidence session. And one of the things I was pushing him for was the work that he's doing with Chris Boardman, but also trying to get that to link up over the border into Derbyshire. Because lots of people in Manchester want to come out to visit us, and lots of people here want to cycle into Manchester. So trying to get that to work together. I was quite encouraged by the Mayor's response. He's committed to work both with the Derbyshire County Council and with Sheffield, and in his words, to try and have an ambitious cycling superhighway running between Manchester and Sheffield. That's quite an ambitious aim, but we're getting there, trying to get people around the table at least talking about it.
Great, thank you. We're out of time for that first Q&A, but thanks to Brian, Katherine and Robert, and for everyone submitting their questions in the chat. I'm going to hand back over to Emma now.
Thanks, Laura. So thank you very much to our speakers in part 1. The Q&A always goes so quickly, and obviously we weren't able to get through all the questions that were submitted. But as I said before, we will try and get some written responses out to everyone who registered for the event for questions that weren't asked. But thank you to our speakers for giving us kind of an excellent sense of what kind of barriers the High Peak's facing at the moment, and what it's looking to overcome with its kind of current transport provision and system. We've also kind of got a good idea of kind of what's on the horizon and the plans that are upcoming. So we're now going to head into the second part of the event and look a bit more closely at how we can get a bit closer to that virtuous cycle that Laurie mentioned in the introduction. We're going to hear presentations from all 3 of our speakers first, and then we'll head into a Q&A. So whilst our speakers are presenting, please do submit your questions for them to the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, and we'll be putting them to them at the end. So to kick us off first, our first presentation is from Sylvia Barrett. Sylvia joined the Campaign for Better Transport, which is a national charity seeking to make high quality, affordable, sustainable transport available to everyone in February 2020. She's responsible for establishing the organisation's policy positions, building its research programme and leading project delivery. And prior to that, Sylvia was research manager at Centre for London, the capital's dedicated think tank, where she headed up the Transport and Environment Research Programme. So among other things, Sylvia is going to be setting out the benefits, opportunities and challenges for sustainable transport systems post-COVID. So many thanks for joining us today, Sylvia. I'm going to pass over to you if you're ready.
Thank you very much, Emma. As you said in the introduction, we're the National Charity for Sustainable Transport. So why do we promote that at the national and the local level? Because car reliance, as previous speaker said, produces many negative impacts, from air pollution and ill health to carbon emissions and road collisions. So we want to make sure that everyone has access to good quality, affordable, reliable, sustainable transport options. But unfortunately, people in rural areas are more reliant on cars than in urban areas. I had some stats prepared. I won't go over them, but I can always bring those in the Q&A. While people in rural areas obviously use cars much more, public transport use is much lower, and that's because of the vicious cycle that previous speakers spoke about. Fewer people use them, therefore it's not economically viable for operators to run more frequent or reliable services. But we also know that many people, even in rural areas, don't own cars, and they rely on public transport for access to employment, to education and leisure, and for vital services like hospital appointments. People that don't have access to a car, they tend to be disabled people, older people, younger people, or people on low incomes. So we know that 45% of all households in the lowest income bracket have no access to a car, as opposed to 14% in the highest income bracket. We are also now working on a project with the APPG on left behind areas, neighborhoods, and we've discovered that some of these areas, more than half of people have no access to a car. Now, Robert mentioned Gamesley and High Peak. I know that's an area with high levels of people that don't have access to a car. It's about 45%. And the public transport access in such areas makes the issue particularly acute for those people. Now, inequalities that are related to car ownership have been really exacerbated by the pandemic, with many people deserting public transport for their cars. So those that don't have a car obviously are feeling more excluded than before. And at the same time, we cannot overstate how devastating the impact has been of the pandemic on public transport. Well, with low public transport use, the government is currently subsidizing that. But if low usage persists in the longer term, then operators will need to really review and potentially cut some services, leaving many people even further isolated than they currently are. So what can be done? In the short term, public transport must be supported financially to weather the storm of the pandemic. In the long term, it will be very important to reform public transport to ensure that it is affordable, it's accessible, reliable, and well integrated within a full network locally in order to attract people back on buses and trains. Now, in this, we think that communities and local authorities should play a much bigger role in reviewing local transport needs, designing an integrated network that best meets those needs, and working with operators and other stakeholders locally to deliver these networks. There's a number of actions that communities can consider, and I know that obviously you already are doing some of those. For example, working with local schools and employers on journey planning, making sure that school children and employees are aware of options that are available to them to travel car-free. Working with local authorities to develop local transport plans which are integrated and with much better information provision. Working with local MPs to identify rail links for restoration as part of the Restoring Your Railway Fund, for example. And there's now a new Levelling Up Fund, which also gives options for local authorities and communities to apply for funding for infrastructure, as well as transport infrastructure and other social infrastructure as well. Communities could be commissioning community transport bus provision, and they can be run as social enterprises, therefore making sure that there are services available where there are specific gaps for socially excluded residents. And local authorities can also look into a number of things, as well as supporting communities in the above. But primarily within that is much better integration between modes and between different types of provision. So on the modes, obviously few people are just a bus user or just a train user. You need information on first and last mile journeys. So when you get off the train, what buses are available to help you reach your final destination? Are there walking and cycling routes? Is there bike hire options, for example? That's something as well to consider in order to boost walking and cycling in local areas. On the different types of provision, so there's obviously commercial bus services, there's local authority subsidized bus services, there's community transport, there's also separate to that school, hospital and social care appointment transport, and these are run by different types of authorities and public services service providers. So what local authorities can do is look at integrating those, making sure that there's limited overlap and that any gaps can be filled by some of those services. But taking that to the next level, there's the issue of total transport, what's being called total transport pilots, and that's local authorities taking over some of those services and coordinating them, pulling budgets and pulling provision, so that hospital services, for example, are being used by other users that require public transport when they're not being used for other purposes, and school transport. Similarly, community transport being integrated with public transport and so on. Other than that, there's obviously demand responsive transport trials, and that's something that was mentioned in the strategy that the local community has produced. There are spots of funding that are available that can support the community to trial provision like that. Supporting car clubs, facilitating lift sharing platforms, that's something that can help reduce car ownership and move to a more sort of car use based model. Improving infrastructure for active travel has been mentioned. But one issue that we've encountered is that there can be low levels of civic engagement and social infrastructure in some areas. Obviously, there's no shortage of that in the High Peak, but it can be a real barrier for some areas in left behind neighborhoods, as we're calling them, to collaborate, to engage in the solutions. And that's why the government and third sector should invest in social infrastructure, community groups and other civic assets to give communities a greater voice, to make sure that they can advocate for local needs. But government should also support local authorities themselves to boost their capacity and their capability to enable them to identify those needs, to plan for how the gaps should be plugged, and to apply for relevant funding. Because many local authorities have suffered budget cuts, they're short of human resource and know-how as well. So we've had the walking and cycling strategy from government. There's a national bus strategy coming out soon as well, and that will hopefully help address some of these issues and reform the way that buses are funded, so it's much more long-term and local authorities can invest in services locally. But as I said, few of us are just bus users or just a cyclist, so we need to have, local authorities need to have those powers to plan for local transport as an integrated network. I'll leave it there. Thank you. I'm happy to answer questions after that.
Thank you very much, Sylvia. We're now going to hear a pre-recorded presentation from Roland Strube, who's the Director of Hayfield Sustainable Transport. And while my colleague Helena is just setting up Roland's presentation, I'm going to give you a quick introduction. So Roland has an engineering background and set up Hayfield Sustainable Transport to run a 6-year project to provide community minibuses and study transport groups that were formed to use them. This led to an EU project, Mass for EU, in which Hayfield Sustainable Transport developed a prototype transport group platform that enables Mass to support development of new transport provision. So the objective now is to demonstrate the TGP, the transport group platform, in building sustainable transport hubs for rural communities. So we're going to hear a bit more about this in Roland's presentation, and then he'll be taking questions with the rest of the speakers.
Good evening. My name is Roland Strube. Many thanks to Emma and Laura. I manage Hayfield Sustainable Transport, which is a community transport operator. For the past 3 years, we have been a partner in an EU project to develop Mobility as a Service, or MaaS. Our part was to enable MaaS platforms to support the development of new transport services that fill gaps in existing provision. As part of the project's Manchester pilot, we developed a new train station shuttle, a peer-to-peer car club, and a shared e-bike scheme. And we are now using the results to develop sustainable transport hubs in the High Peak. We found 4 problems that need to be solved for any new service to be developed. As an example, I will look at the effect these have on the development of a train station shuttle for rail commuters. Financial risk. Financial risk here is that revenue from use does not cover costs, and the responsibility for this risk is currently taken by transport providers. It is difficult for transport providers to manage this risk because they're trying to provide a transport service to people who already use private cars to fill the gap. They also don't know who it is that's making these journeys, and they have no communication links with them. So they have responsibility for the risk, but no control over it. And they address this problem by not developing the service. Private cars. If our rail commuters leave their cars at home and pay to use the new shuttle, they would be paying for two forms of transport. To escape this problem, the rail commuter could sell their car, but this is difficult because they use it in the evenings and at weekends to fill other gaps in provision, or they could join a car club, so they could use a car when they needed one on a pay-as-you-go basis. But there is no car club in the area. It's another gap in provision. Its risk is too high for providers, mainly because too many people own private cars. Integrating demand. This diagram shows the station shuttle and a car club. Separately, these two new services are not financially viable, but the users have combined them so that they are viable. By integrating their demand for the two services, the users have integrated provision of the two services. It is the users that have done this, not the providers. This is important because it directs us to work with users to integrate transport rather than with providers. Getting this the wrong way round might explain why transport has failed to become sustainable over the past 40 years. If users have control over integrating transport, it suggests that some of the financial risk should be distributed to them rather than providers. Data and communication links. This map shows anonymised postcodes of NHS staff in Derbyshire and commuters to Trafford Park in Manchester. Where they overlap, it's possible to find rail commuters and healthcare workers with potentially compatible need for a car club and a new train station shuttle, as we saw in the last diagram. Organisations which make journeys necessary, such as employers, hospitals, schools, ticketed events, etc., depend on transport being provided, but until now have had no way to be involved in its development. And yet they control valuable data and communication links that could be used to identify compatible demand and prompt changes in behaviour. These are all activities for managing financial risk and suggest that financial risk could also be distributed to these organisations. Well, two examples where data and communication links are used to develop transport. The first one is a shuttle between Hayfield and Hope Valley College. Parents of pupils got together to set up a school shuttle between Hayfield and Hope, and they asked the school to prompt other parents who live in Hayfield to get involved. The second example is Man United supporters who started to use our minibuses to travel to home games. The football club got involved by informing season ticket holders in Hayfield about the new arrangement. In both cases, the transport was made financially viable and affordable by involving the organisations that made the journeys necessary. We are now working to develop sustainable transport hubs for first, last mile transport at a local level, and the intention is to build a network of these across the High Peak. We are working with people and businesses in the area to develop on-demand shuttles, peer-to-peer car clubs, shared e-bikes, e-cargo bikes, community electric charging points, and resident parking permits. That's all. Thank you very much indeed. Bye.
Many thanks for the presentation, Roland, and we look forward to seeing you in the Q&A after our next speaker. So our final speaker is Lee Thompson, who is the Partnerships Manager for Sustrans in Yorkshire, who works closely with local authorities and other partners to develop a region where it's easier for more people to walk and cycle their everyday journeys. Lee has over 25 years of experience in project management and coordination, working for big national charities and local organisations with a focus on community health and sustainable transport. Lee's going to be talking to us a bit more about how we can challenge that current car culture that we've been talking about and influence positive behaviour change towards how we travel in our rural areas. So many thanks for joining us, Lee. I'm going to pass over to you now.
Yeah, thanks, Emma. I'm just going to share my screen, everybody. Here we go. Right, start from the beginning. Yeah, hopefully that will go bigger. Yeah, and everybody, yeah, I know you can't hear me, but hopefully you can see that. Yeah, so thanks, Emma. Yeah, I do have a bit of a vested interest because I don't live too far away from the High Peak, so I do often get out and about. So we've got the iconic NCN Route 62 that runs through the High Peak, so that's of real interest to Sustrans. So really, in the short time that I've got, I just want to give you a bit of a flavour about Sustrans in terms of the work that we do, the vision, the objectives and the values that we have as an organisation. So it's only in the last kind of 3-4 years that we decided that we needed to have a clearer vision, and it's quite a simple vision, because what we want to do is just create places where, you know, everyone can benefit through travelling, through making happiness levels even higher, and through making, you know, the places where we spend our time, places where we can, you know, exercise and socialise and connect. We've kind of got 5 values that run through our organisation. We try to be as inclusive as possible, and these will be referred to later on in my 5 minutes that I've got with you. Having the courage to question, which I think is really important, particularly at grassroots level, you know, where you've got a lot of interest and a lot of, you know, dedicated volunteers out there that are willing to push forward grassroots schemes, which is, you know, exactly how Sustrans came into being over 40 years ago. So that's still a very important part of our value system. Acting local and thinking big. That's kind of key to a lot of the work that we're currently doing across the north, particularly around what we call livable cities and towns projects. Getting things done together is about bringing everybody on that journey. So no stone is left unturned in terms of who we engage with and how we engage with people. And we're not, you know, too proud to admit that a lot of this is uncharted territory, and we are learning as we go along. So we don't always have the answers to the questions, and you know, there are times where we might have to hold our hands up and say, yeah, we're not quite sure about that.
Hi, Lee, it's Emma. I don't want to cut you off. We're not seeing your slides full screen, and we just had a comment to say that they're a little bit small to read. So we can see your presenter, but I just wanted to let you know in case there's anything you could do about it from your end.
Back on back. See, no, I'm not. I don't think there is, Emma, actually. No, is it too small, is it?
It's just the white writing that we can't read.
Right.
Matt Watson is chipping in from the chat, who says you can go to display settings at the top of the screen.
Display settings at the top of the screen.
Yeah, just in between show taskbar and end slideshow.
Between show. No, it's not.
No
it's
worries.
Not coming up.
Just anything that's too small, people might not be able to see, but I just wanted to let you know.
Yeah, no worries. Yeah, it's mainly just as reference for me, really, and it said people looking at my mug. So we've got the vision, we've got the values, we've got 2 objectives in Sustrans. We've got paths for everyone, which is a report that we conducted about 2-3 years ago now, which is essentially an audit of the National Cycle Network. And what we found from that audit is that not a lot of the network is what we would describe as good. In fact, it's very poor. So since that, we've been on a bit of a drive nationally to try and upgrade the NCN to make it as inclusive, as safe, as usable as possible. So as you can imagine, that is quite an ambition, which is going to take quite a bit of time and investment. So that's number one objective. Second objective is around what we call our Creating Livable Towns program. So essentially what that is it's usually centered around communities, schools that either want to change in their physical environment or have been kind of earmarked by the local authority as a place that needs to change based on deprivation levels. So this gives you a kind of visual representation about what we do. So it's, without getting into too many technical terms, it's things around sort of filtered permeability. So that's using temporary blockades to give people that user experience of what it's like to get about your day-to-day business in either a car-free environment or a reduced car traffic environment. So we're doing quite a lot of work, not too far from where a lot of people are, I guess, in High Peak, in Levenshulme in Manchester at the minute, and also supplementing that with some work on the B lines as well. We do quite a lot of policy research and influencing because a lot of our job, we're not really a campaigning and a lobbying organisation. But what we do is we produce quite a lot of information which can then be used as an evidence base to try and convince senior decision makers about the many benefits of prioritising active travel in terms of strategy and in terms of budgets as well. An example here, some of the local work that we've been involved with at Sheffield, and this covered the city region. And I think this is probably what's needed as a first step for key stakeholders in the High Peaks. And what you see here is the origins and the birth of a strategic South Yorkshire cycle route. This was back in the days before gear change, the latest government document that came out, which is also about walking. So many of these routes that you see on here are also walk friendly, but it's just not really emphasised. And I think for any kind of organisation to move forward, this is the kind of information that you need to help prioritise what schemes you work on and where you work on them, and bring stakeholders together. So I think in terms of the rural issues, we've kind of hinted at a few of them, which are very relevant to the High Peaks. The poor integrated transport links, the inconsistent and incoherent networks. A key one is around design standards. So we are really hot at Sustrans on working with partners who are going to adopt the latest design standards, because there's no point installing cycle routes if they're not going to be fit for purpose. So that's quite a key one that we're focused on. Mentioned that previously about terrain topography, a really difficult one to navigate. Obviously we've got e-bikes which help in that, but we're still in the very early days of e-bike culture. And I think probably one of the biggest barriers that we've got for rural communities is, I think Robert mentioned it earlier, is to do with, there is a concentration and a focus now on urban areas through the LC WIP, which is the local cycle walking infrastructure plans, which all local authorities are being asked to produce, which is a good thing. Unfortunately, what that means is that a lot of that focus is in urban areas and it's leaving out rural areas like the High Peak. So it's almost like there's a vacuum there that needs filling. And I think there's probably a need for some kind of rural LC WIP, not just in the High Peaks, but lots of other rural areas as well. And then finally, in terms of the biggest challenges that we've got, I think we're probably all very aware, I don't need to mention that, climate change, air quality, and how we're going to tackle that. And it's going to be a long old slog. It's about winning hearts and minds and changing culture, which is not going to happen overnight, but the kind of conversations we're having now and some of the you know, gear change documents that we've seen produced recently is going to help us do that and kind of embed active travel across many different agendas, because that's what it is. It's not an independent kind of one-dimensional project. You know, it's going to require lots of different disciplines to work together, and we're very aware of that, and that's what we try to do as part of our job and part of my day-to-day job. And there's a few kind of contact details if people are not already following us on Twitter and Facebook. There's a few details there, but I can share them with you if anybody wants to message me afterwards. And that's it.
Thank you, Lee, Sylvia and Roland, for all your contributions there. We have Q&A now, but we're running a bit over time. So if I could ask all of the speakers to give quick fire answers where possible. And I know everyone's been trying to answer them in the Q&A box as well, so thank you for that. First question here is for Lee, and Russell asks, what action can be taken to make cycling for active commutes rather than just recreational reasons? Lee, can you answer that one? You're on mute.
Yeah, thanks for that, Robert. Yeah, good question. I think I kind of answered that in that slide around the strategic network. I think what you've got in the high peaks is you've got a lot of grassroots support and community organisations, which is fantastic, and they're all very aligned in terms of what they want. You know, a sustainable, well-connected network, you know, that can be used both for commuting and for leisure. The first step in achieving that has got to be bringing together those organisations and then agreeing on what are the priorities, which I think you can only really do that through conducting a mapping and a scoping report, you know, which identifies existing and potential networks. And then I think it's down to good old-fashioned debate and discussion as to, you know, what becomes a priority. And then that will elevate that as a you know, as an area that's serious about active travel, you know, because it's done its research, it's got its evidence base, and without that, it's very difficult to progress schemes.
Great, thanks, Lee. And Sylvia, can you answer this one quickly? Potentially, is there a successful model in another country of reliable, integrated, affordable public travel in a rural community that we could be looking to in the High Peak for inspiration?
I was trying to think of that and answer in the session, but I couldn't think of anything specifically on rural. I can promise to have a think and get back. There's lots of schemes, like in Germany, in some cities, they've made public transport free, for example. Obviously, Holland and others, the Achievement sort of cycling story to strive for. Lots of things to duplicate, but obviously lots of different backgrounds as well and structures. So there's only so much we can borrow.
Great, thanks, Sylvia. And just one quick one for you, Roland, before we move on. So this person asks, can you explain a bit more what you mean about the first and last mile and how that would apply to a rural constituency where there's large distances between our homes and services?
First and last mile is just a phrase. It doesn't literally mean 1 mile at the beginning and 1 mile at the end of the journey. It's, for example, in Hayfield, it means being able to get from Hayfield to the Greater Manchester Transport Network in order to commute by rail, for example, into Manchester rather than driving the whole way. So, yeah, does that answer the question?
Yes, I think so. Thank you to everyone who submitted questions. As Emma said at the beginning, we'll try and get some written answers for those that haven't been answered tonight. But I'm going to hand over to Emma now and thank Sylvia, Roland and Lee for your contributions.
Yes, so thank you so much to our speakers in parts 1 and 2. You'll see that we are running a little bit tight to time. So we're going to go quickly into our final section of the event, where we'll be hearing from Age UK about their sustainable transport service project in Cornwall, and then we'll go into our final constituent Q&A with Robert Largan. So Anne and Lee, if you're ready to kick off, please do. Anne, Lewis and Lee Davis are from Age UK Cornwall, and they have over 40 years of providing, for over 40 years have been providing transport solutions throughout the UK. In 2019, they started the Sustainable Transport Project in Cornwall, and they've developed a tailored model to support individuals, local communities and the health service, utilising a fleet of fully accessible electric vehicles. So if you guys are ready, I'll let you kick off.
That's great, thank you, Emma. Firstly, thank you for having us, and secondly, listening to a number of the speakers this evening, we've felt and continue to feel some of those same challenges you're facing, whether it's high levels of rurality, whether it's being a tourist hotspot, social isolation, lack or perceived lack of infrastructure, and certainly a lack of funding. However, we want to offer a little bit of hope and celebrate and shine a light on the Sustainable Transport Project that we've seen make a huge difference in the local community. So I'm going to hand to Anne, who's going to tell you how it started, and hopefully I can finish off with a nice little case study.
Good evening, everyone. Well, it feels like a long time coming down in Cornwall. We're like a community transport organisation, and we launched it in 2018, our Sustainable Transport Service. And I would say that for us as an organisation, good networking together with people like Cornwall Rural Community Charity has really helped us big time. We focused on local communities and focus groups to identify areas of need, really. And you can imagine in Cornwall, as well as everywhere else in parts of the country, there's lots of different people that are cut off. So we've basically got 6 fully accessible electric vehicles, and we've got actually 8 charge points now. So basically at each centre where our vehicles are, there's 2 charge points. So for future, we're looking at people maybe able to use one of our charge points, so that would help the area. Basically, we've got a membership scheme and it's for members, for groups and for individuals. I think individuals were quite shocked at first when we said there's a membership scheme, and what we're trying to do is people, first of all, that don't really want to keep their car on the road and can't afford to buy a vehicle, to do a membership scheme and maybe do some volunteering in between. And they're fully trained, because I think getting into an EV or electric vehicle is not as plain sailing as some people may think. And because they're accessible as well, we do make sure that all the training is fully completed. It's operated by volunteers, but we've got that. But I would say with the situation with the COVID, staff have been using the vehicles as well. So what we aim to do, we work with community venues. We're looking at 2 of our vehicles are at GP surgeries, they're at community centres and our day centres as well. So there's a mixture of like social groups. So benefits to our community, I would say I've been in community transport for quite a long time, and I would say that it's a privilege being able to have these 6 vehicles around Cornwall. They do help to build community resilience. They're environmentally friendly, and I must say as well that they save the passenger money. We've managed to, at the moment, take people to their COVID vaccinations at less cost than it would be with a taxi, or even with some of our other projects on our community transport side. They're easy to use and wheelchair friendly as well, which is to me, we would never ever get a vehicle that's not accessible. It's really important to us as an organisation. And they reach some of the most isolated people in Cornwall. And they are peaceful. I would say that when you're explaining to people that have never experienced driving an electric vehicle before, they don't understand why you get behind the wheel and it's really quite relaxing to drive. They are key in providing essential support for our organisation during crisis situations.
Thanks, Anne. And I'm really here now to tell you a little bit about the positivity and the impact. We've seen a huge increase in demand, especially with the uncertainty of COVID-19 and the added pressures that's brought to all of us. Meaning we've had to remodel these essential services and deliver some of that practical support to those very most people in need, if you like. This story is a lovely mother and daughter story that I'll run through with you as quickly as I can. Bernice, who you see pictured there, asked our transport department if we had the need for any extra volunteers. Of course, we said, God, yes, please help us. She's employed by a local charity and works within discharge unit at Royal Cornwall Hospital. She helps patients that may be socially isolated return home. As you can imagine, we wanted to get her on board pretty damn quickly. We got her trained in all the PPE procedures and processes. She then went and met a local pharmacy who set her up and got her started. After a couple of days, she was joined on her trips by a wonderful daughter who'd recently been furloughed within her job and was feeling a little bit of a loss. So we thought, why not? 2 eyes, certainly better than 1, and we can reach more people. Bernice and her daughter have now helped us deliver hundreds of prescriptions throughout Cornwall, often to the elderly and the most vulnerable people in Cornwall. Some who haven't seen anyone for days, meaning they could twin in a welfare check, offer support, ask if that person needs supplies or ongoing telephone support. I'll leave you with a couple of quotes she gave us, which I think is really beautiful. Bernice said, it's surprising how it doesn't seem to take long for you to start recognizing addresses and locations. That's not to say that I always remember them. Thank goodness for SatNav. Sometimes I just stumble over the addresses and I'm looking for somebody completely by chance. Even though the people of Redruth and Cambourne and the surrounding areas are thankful to AGK Cornwall for the service, both my daughter and I are grateful for them for letting us help out. Volunteering has meant the world to us, and it's given us appreciation of the difficulties that people are facing during this extraordinary time. I'll flick really quickly to the next slide, as I know we're getting short on time. I just want to show you how sustainable transport wraps around several areas of the charity, AGK Cornwall and TAP, our transport division. In particular, we could focus on some of those areas where we see 3,306 medication deliveries, 4,000 welfare visits, 3,000 meals prepared with £20,000 worth of food and shopping being received, all through our electric vehicles. They really are essential for our charity and for the people of Cornwall, but we couldn't do it without those people of Cornwall. The future's definitely a bit more greener than it was before down here, and thanks to our partners, we've got a bit of an infrastructure to build upon. Even Cornwall Council, who've been great and real tremendous supporters of the project, they've commissioned 150 new charge points across Cornwall. So we are really looking forward to a much better 2021. Thanks.
Thanks so much to Lee and Anne for that overview of the project. It's really wonderful to see what a positive vision is possible when the will, resource and support all kind of come together in a place. So as they've mentioned at the end of their slide there, please do email them with any questions you have about the project, as unfortunately we don't really have the time to do that within today's event. So now we're going to go to the very last part of our event, and I'd like to invite Robert to turn his camera back on, as we have some constituents ready and waiting to ask questions about overcoming those barriers in part 1, utilising those solutions we learned about in part 2, and kind of actioning those next steps required for a more sustainable transport system for the High Peak. So Anne, if you're ready, it'd be great if you could turn your camera on and ask your question.
Hi, Robert. Many thanks for joining us. I just want to pick up on something you already talked about, which was the government funding for cycle networks. You mentioned that in the second tranche, the money all went to Chesterfield, so no money has yet been allocated for routes within and into the High Peak. So can you press the Department for Transport and Derbyshire County Council to ensure that High Peak gets sufficient from the Active Travel Fund to finance a high quality cycle network?
Yeah, hi, Anne. Absolutely, already doing so, already having a lot of conversations with the Minister responsible for active travel and the responsible officers and councillors at Derbyshire County Council. But hopefully we can get, as I said in my initial comments, get Buxton, which was the runner-up in the second tranche, up to be first place in the third tranche, and get some other schemes on the go as well. So absolutely.
Thank you very much indeed, Robert. I'm now going to pass over to Steve to ask the next question.
Robert, I really appreciate you coming tonight. In Hope Valley Climate Action, we asked if it was wishful thinking that we can get better sustainable rural transport, or are there successful precedents from elsewhere in the UK or in Europe that we can learn from? Our research suggests that coordinated transport planning by a single public authority is the key to success. So although services are run by different public and private bodies, the fares, the timetables and the information are coordinated. Robert, can you work with the Secretary of State for Transport and look to extend the coverage of transport for Greater Manchester to the whole of the High Peak so that we can benefit from better timetabling and lower fares?
Thanks, Steve. And that's a great question. And there's a few little bits in there. So I'll start with, are there any examples of rural transport, sustainable transport and integrated transport that we can try and copy from? Funnily enough, just yesterday, the Transport Select Committee, we were taking evidence from transport experts from around the world. Yesterday, we had experts from Sweden, from France, and from Singapore on exactly this point, and trying to learn some of the lessons that they've used. I think you can go on and watch it or read the transcripts. It's a really, really interesting session. Sweden, in particular, which has quite big rural parts of that country, had some really interesting lessons to learn. And exactly one of the points that they were talking about was about having this integrated point. And I think that a key one here is particularly when it comes to bus travel. And at the moment in the UK, only London has a regulated bus system with TfL, and everywhere else it's unregulated. And I think that we need to be looking to try and, if it's good enough for London, it's definitely good enough for the rest of us, and that's something we absolutely want to be rolling out. I'd add that actually our city mayors already have the power to do that, but at the moment they seem quite reluctant to do so. So that's definitely something that needs looking at. And then on the final point on having it integrated across, not just in Manchester, not just in Sheffield, but including us in the middle, that's a really, really good point. It's one that I've talked about an awful lot. Now, I live in Glossop, which obviously is in the High Peak, but we are already covered by the Greater Manchester Transport Subsidy, which makes a huge difference. And that's why if you look at commuter figures pre-COVID, the numbers in Glossop are so much higher than anywhere else in the rest of the High Peak. And a huge part of that is to do with the cost. It's also a double problem because we're having the nonsense of people driving from the High Peak to places like Disley to get a cheaper fare. So it's already massively contributing to the really big problems with traffic on the A6 corridor. So yeah, I'm really keen to try and get this extended out further. Part of the difficulty is convincing the mayors of Sheffield and Greater Manchester to give up money for people who can't vote for them. So it's a politically very challenging thing to do. It would also involve the only way of really doing it, I think, is trying to get Derbyshire County Council to fund part of it, but then they'd have to justify to the rest of the county why they're not funding them as well. So it is a bit of a political minefield, but it's definitely something that I want to try and get rolled out. I'm talking about it often. I'll happily raise it yet again with the Rail Minister, and keep pushing on that point.
Many thanks for such a thoughtful answer. I'm going to hand over to Joanna.
Yes, people have talked about the car dependence in rural areas, and have also touched on some of the solutions. For example, co-ownership clubs, and there are also other forms of demand responsive transport, which might be a solution to the car culture. Sustrans have claimed that co-ownership and demand responsive transport, such as private hire vehicles, could save drivers £3,500 a year and reduce individuals' carbon footprints by 20%. So a good thing all round. What can we do to encourage individuals and organisations in High Peak to support ride sharing and co-ownership of cars?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And there's also a lot of studies that show that if people move to a pay-as-you-go kind of car share system, that massively leads to a much lower car use in general, and people looking for more, they're using public transport more and using active travel. So another really good reason to try and push people onto that. I'd add that, funnily enough, I tabled a series of questions in Parliament today on this exact topic, trying to probe the government for what they're doing on promoting car shares. I haven't had a response yet because I've only tabled them today, but I look forward to some responses. And I'd also say that it isn't just about trying to have car shares. We'd also want to see some electric car shares. There is a government funding for a programme on this for electric car shares, but it's quite limited and it's only in London. I'd very much want to see that extended out, and love to have a scheme like that in the Hope Valley and the rest of the High Peak. And yeah, the point about trying to encourage people, I'm very happy to promote to people the options that are available. I also think that if we can get a group of people who are really keen to set one up, I'd be happy to try and take that to companies and try and convince them that there is local demand, because I think the point you made about car sharing in rural areas being a really good potential solution is a really good one. So happy to look at all of that. Hopefully we'll get some interesting answers from the government as well, from the questions I've taken today.
Yep, thank you very much. So now I'm handing over to Roger.
Hi, Roger.
Hi, Robert. Thanks for joining us. In Hope Valley Climate Action, we're really keen to see the Hope Valley become a national demonstration area for what sustainable travel would look like. Better opportunities for walking and cycling, excellent public transport, mitigating car use, trying to put it all together, the many different things we've heard about this evening. So we have the concept of a national pilot scheme, which we're calling Travelling Light, which we're hoping to roll out. Will you support us in getting support from the Department for Transport to get that underway?
Yeah, absolutely. I'd be very happy to take this to the Department for Transport, raise it with them, and ask if we can get officials from the DFT to meet with you and see if we can discuss it and progress things. I think that'd be really good. And you know, it's really encouraging that you're pushing ahead with this. I'll do whatever I can to help.
Thank you. Back to Emma.
Thank you both. Thank you very much, Robert, for taking those constituent questions this evening. And thank you to everyone for all your many questions that I'm sorry we couldn't get through all of them tonight. We will try and get written responses to the ones that weren't answered. That does bring tonight's event to a close. Thank you so much for joining us today. Please look out for that follow-up email, which will be coming out tomorrow, and it will give you more information about how Hope for the Future can support you. If you want to take, the conversation that we've been having tonight forward, please do get in touch with us. So a feedback form is going to pop up when your browser closes. So if you've got a couple of minutes before you rush off and grab your dinner, please do fill it in. And all that's left to say is thank you to our wonderful speakers, thank you to our constituency team, our Hope for the Future team behind the scenes, and a huge thank you to all of you for attending on this Thursday evening. Have a wonderful night.
Thank you.